Good morning again. We are going to start our first session. Our first keynote address, Professor Hakan Kara is going to talk about inflation expectations under high inflation. You all know him, Professor Kara from Bilkent University. He was former chief economist of Turkish Central Bank. He extensively worked on macroeconomic issues and monetary policies. I don't want to lose much time to introduce him. Please applaud him and welcome him to the floor.
So good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. Do you hear me? So, thanks to the Turkish Economic Association for putting up this conference and this wonderful location. When I was invited first to give this talk, actually I thought that it's a good time to take a perspective out of our research on inflation expectations, because inflation is becoming a hot topic recently, and Professor Kazdağlı has already explained why. It's a perfect storm, and the inflation and inflation expectations are getting more attention. So I thought that, since we have been conducting this research agenda in the last 15 years, I thought that it would be a good time to take stock and put some reflections on what's going on in the global economy. So let me start by this question of why study inflation expectations. And I don't have to convince you, actually, but let me just formally try to put why we started studying inflation expectations. I started working on the inflation expectations right at the time when I stepped in the Central Bank of Turkey after the PhD, because it's kind of a very relevant topic, obviously, for the central banks. And so it's a key input for monetary policy, and the central banks are obsessed about the credibility gap, the difference between expectations and the inflation targets. And obviously, it's the real interest rate that determines the behavior of economic agents. So you have to look at the real interest rate, but in order to measure the real interest rate, you have to have an estimate of inflation expectations, and then comes this research about expectations. And the second reason is basically more theoretical and also practical, because inflation expectations is a driver of inflation itself. Okay? So it has implications for modeling, because if different agents have different kind of expectations in a model, then it has tremendous implications for the practical modeling purposes. So from both the theoretical and the practical perspective, inflation expectations is very interesting for the researchers. And once you start working with the inflation expectations, you run into many dimensions, and there is a line of research on each power here, because when you want to start on inflation expectations, actually you have this measurement problem. So how are you going to measure inflation expectations? Right? One way is to ask people. I can just ask you and take an average of your expectations of your forecast of inflation, and then that's it. Or you can just go to the financial markets and use, for example, the nominal interest rate and the real interest rate implied by the inflation index bonds, and then use that information to extract the inflation expectations. And there's a whole line of literature on that. And the second line of literature is looking at the question of which expectations. Is it the firm's expectations? Is it the households or the professional financial markets? So which expectations should we care about? I mean, which one is relevant for the inflation dynamics, and which one is relevant for central banks? And the third line of research asks the question of, what is driving inflation expectations? So we want to understand why the expectations are moving in a certain direction. And related to this issue, obviously, is the behavior of inflation under low versus high inflation. Behavior of expectation when the inflation moves to a higher level is very relevant now, because the inflation is moving all over the world. So that's a global problem. And in the high inflationary environment, it's not trivial how the inflation expectations respond, because that may have important implications for the inflation dynamics. And there's as I mentioned, there's a strand of literature on each bullet. And we have been conducting research actually on all these aspects. And recent years, we have started focusing more on the drivers of inflation expectations, and to understand also the heterogeneities between different agents and so on. So let me be more explicit on what I mean by the interaction between expectation formation and the modeling process, and why does it matter to have heterogeneous inflation expectations across agents. So think about a typical open economy new Keynesian model. You have this Phillips curve where the inflation depends on the expected inflation and some past inflation, but in this equation, the main driver of the inflation is inflation expectations, right? And so the question is, who is the relevant agent here? So which expectations should we care about? And it's the firm's expectation, because the firms are the real price setters here. So when we are talking about the Phillips curve, actually it is the firm's expectations that counts most, right? But when you go to the asset prices, for example, in this equation, in this model, you can have a UIP condition embedded with the risk premia, and in that equation, the most relevant agent is financial markets. They price the assets and exchange rates and so on. And when you go to the IS curve, actually, the main actor is the households, because they make this intertemporal decision to consume today or tomorrow. So it should be mostly the households' expectations that matters. So, and then the question is, do all these expectations behave similarly? So in the conventional general equilibrium models, you have model consistent expectations, right? So every agent knows everything, and the others know that what you are, others know what you know, and the higher order expectations are known. So there's a consistent one expectation that drives everybody's behavior, and that's the. But in reality, that may not be true, right? I mean, so that's an empirical question. How do agents form expectations? Do the agents really have full information ration expectations, or if the firms, for example, have bounded rationality or having some limited information framework, then it has important implications actually for the models. So we have conducted some research actually to understand how these agents form their expectations through time. So another issue that I mentioned is that the market-based versus surveys-based inflation expectations. That's a measurement problem. So this blue line is the market-based inflation expectation, which is just extracted from the nominal bonds and inflation index bonds. That's a breaker in inflation. Okay? And Cappadocia has a lot of work on this. And this kind of research actually is very intensive. So you have a whole line of strand of literature. We also worked in the Turkish case, but we decided that in the Turkish case, there's a lot of noise. So, for example, look at this blue line. It's much more volatile. There's a lot of volatility here. And then in the recent period, just the relationship breaks up. So in theory, this orange line and the blue line should go hand in hand. but it doesn't because of the liquidity premium and inflation risk. This blue line is kind of showing a lot of volatility. So I did one paper on this, but then I gave up because there's a lot of noise and it's very difficult to extract information from the financial markets in a country like Turkey, where the financial markets are relatively less developed, and there is a financial repression by the government on asset prices. So it's the information content is not too high. So we decided to work with this orange line, which is the survey-based expectations. And so throughout the years, we mostly worked with this survey-based expectations. But the survey-based expectations have their own problems. So they're not problem-free. So if you look at this chart, here I show the inflation realization, which is the blue line, with the inflation expectations published 12 months ago. So at first sight, I mean, you would immediately realize that there's something wrong here, because the inflation realizations are 85% of the times are above the gray line, the inflation expectations. So the market expectations seems to be biased. Does it mean that we should throw away this expectation series? No, because still this gray line, the average expectations, have a lot of information because it moves up and down, and if we understand why is it increasing or decreasing in certain episodes, we can have a better idea about the inflation dynamics. And also you can go to the cross-sectional data and work with the dispersion in inflation, uncertainty kind of measures and so on. So we continue to work with this research literature, and I will show you some sample findings, because let's say, I mean, we have been working with this topic in the last 15 years, so I cannot just show everything here, but just some summary findings. First of all, the literature on the determinants of inflation expectations. So there's a really whole line of research, and I cannot summarize everything here. People are working on the inflation expectations on the professional forecasters, financial markets. There are papers on the firms, on households. So there's also people also separate between emerging economies and advanced economies. So and then one common result that comes out of this research agenda is in the emerging economies, the agents are much more attentive to the macroeconomic developments. So that comes out as a common result. So in an emerging market, the economic agents like firms and households, they are more responsive to the inflation development. So when the inflation moves up, they change their expectations. But in the advanced economies, there's not much response. So there are studies on New Zealand, in US, and they show that the firms are kind of indifferent to inflation releases. So they just don't look at inflation, because the inflation has been stable in the last 2-3 decades in the advanced economies, and so they stopped looking at inflation. Okay? But in countries like Turkey, the firms have to watch the inflation figures very closely, because if they don't, actually, they will probably go out of business. So most of this research, let me go back to the literature. Most of this research is basically looking at some form of econometric equation and trying to explain inflation expectation by using macroeconomic data and also some firm-specific factors or individual-specific factors. So they just regress the inflation expectations on several variables. And so that's the common issue. But in recent years, we take a different approach. What we do is we directly go to the survey participants and survey the survey participants and ask them actually what is driving their inflation forecast. So rather than starting with the econometric analysis, we just go to the survey participants, ask them actually how do they form their inflation expectations, and get their answers, and then cross-check that with the empirical analysis. That's why I call it a hybrid approach. it's a hybrid approach because, it depends on surveys plus econometric analysis. So specifically what we do is we just give a list of variables to the survey participants. So it's like 20, 25 different variables that are supposed to affect inflation expectations, inflation forecasts. And then ask them to state the degree of importance, and they give them some grade from high to no importance, so just rank them. And then aggregate all the results and rank all the variables from the most important to the least important. So here are the results. This chart shows the quantified version of the ranking. And so on the left-hand side, you have the most important variables. On the right-hand side, you have the least important variables. So the one striking result that came out of this survey is that the inflation target was the least important variable. That's sad for a central bank, but sometimes facts are bitter. So we conducted this survey in 2018, just after the Pastor Brunson crisis. And so by then, the inflation expectations, the role of the targets as an expectations had already diminished at that time. Okay? And what are the most important variables that are driving the inflation forecast? There is the exchange rate, monetary policy stance, oil prices, economic activity, and the past inflation figures. So we just take the most important variables above a threshold, above 0.2, and then use them in the regressions. So we just take them and use them in the regressions. In order to detect the changing behavior of expectations, we look at the rolling regressions, panel rolling regressions, to see how the coefficients are shifting through time. So the nice thing about using microdata is, when you use surveys, you can access microdata sometimes, and that addresses the endogeneity problem, because if you work with the time series models, probably you know that how hard it is to find an exogenous variable. There's always this simultaneous behavior between variables, and it's very difficult to find very good instruments. But when you use the microdata, then you can use the individual-based information on the left-hand side as a dependent variable, and then explain it by using the macro factors. So that partly eases the endogeneity problem that you are having. We have, in our research, we have basically used several surveys, but the most important ones are the survey of market participants and the business tendency surveys. They're published by, and they are compiled by the central bank. And the first one is mostly financial markets. There are also professionals, but like 85% of those participants are financial markets. So we can take this as financial markets. And then the second one is the manufacturing firms, mostly large firms, medium-sized firms. So we conducted some research using that data. And let me just summarize, put a summary table on what we have found. So in this regression table, what we did was basically we used the 12-month ahead inflation expectations of respondent I at time t. So on the left-hand side, you have the expectation of firms or expectations of the professionals. So here is the result. I will first show the professionals. What we do is we estimate this econometric equation by using the macro variables as explanatory variables. So we use inflation, the most recent inflation, the past inflation, that's the history of inflation, and then monetary policy surprises, exchange rate, industrial production growth to represent the economic activity, and the oil price. And you can see that all the variables are significant. Most of them are significant at 1% level, and they have the right sign in the sense that, I mean, theoretically, you would expect, for example, when the inflation goes up, or the past inflation goes up, you would expect the inflation expectations to go up. So it's a positive. But then you have a negative here. What is the negative coefficient? It is the policy surprise. So again, this is theoretically right, because when the central bank increases the interest rate unexpectedly, the inflation expectations come down. Okay? And then when the industrial production goes up, when the economic activity gets stronger, people expect higher inflation. It's not highly significant, but there's some significance. And then when the oil price goes up, people revise their expectations up. So what about the firms? So let's compare the professionals with the firms. Okay? So that's businesses are firms. So the businesses respond mostly to the past inflation data and the exchange rate depreciation, but we don't see much significant response from policy surprise or the oil prices. And the industrial production has the wrong sign in the sense that when the economic activity expands strongly, the firms decrease their inflation expectations. So that shows that the firms have a supply side view of the economy, whereas the professionals have the Phillips curve type of relationship in their mind. So it's the positive. So you can see that the expectation formation of the firms versus the professionals is very different. And the professionals respond to a wider set of variables. And we added I will add two more regressions with the fixed effects. When you add the fixed effects here, basically what you see is that improves the fit for the firms substantially. Okay? And that shows that there are deeper firm level characteristics that explain the cross-sectional dispersion of inflation expectations between firms. Whereas on the professionals, you don't see much improvement in the fit because the macro variables probably explain the inflation expectations very well, or the professionals, and it's a more homogeneous group. So overall, I can tell you that the expectations behavior differ across agents. So the firms and the financial markets expectations behavior is different from each other. I know that it's difficult to read the table, so let me support my findings, my arguments with the graphs, which will be more readable for you. This chart shows the inflation expectations of firms, which is the blue line, inflation expectations of the financial markets, which is the red line. So you can immediately see that this blue line is almost always above the red line. So the firms are more pessimistic actually about inflation somehow. And this yellow line is the inflation itself, the inflation realization. So 90% of the times, the financial markets expect inflation tomorrow to be lower than inflation today, whereas the firms expect inflation tomorrow to be higher than today. So there is a significant asymmetry in this. The firms are always more pessimistic. It will be worse. And the financial markets say, oh, it will be better. This is the first moment, the mean of the expectation. So let me show the second moment, which is the standard deviation. And you can see that this blue line, which is the firm's cross-sectional dispersion of expectations, is much higher. So this we call it disagreement. And so here we put two measures of disagreement. One is the cross-sectional standard deviation, and the second is the interdecide range. And in both of those measures, you can see that the firm's disagreement is much higher than the financial markets expectation. So these are pretty standard in the literature. I mean, we just do it for the Turkish case. But what is more important is probably, which is not in the literature, is we look at the percentage of firms changing inflation forecasts. Okay? So that's kind of how frequently people revise their inflation expectations. Okay? And you can see that the firms and the professionals were moving together. But by mid-2013, the financial markets expectation formation started diverging. What the financial markets actually started revising their forecasts more frequently. Why? Probably because of the fact that after mid-2013, the Turkish lira started depreciating continuously, and that probably prompted the financial markets to be more alert to the exchange rate developments, and they started revising their inflation forecasts more frequently. That's one explanation. And the firms were sleeping at that time. So when did the firms wake up, actually? When the inflation went to double digits here, the firms started revising their expectations upwards. I mean, they started revising it more frequently. So this chart also tells us that the inflation expectation formation is basically depends on the macroeconomic environment. So it changes. I mean, the behavior of the agents shift through time. Okay? So then there comes the natural question: has the expectations behavior changed? Okay? So one idea that comes up immediately is, so here we mentioned that the something has changed after, for the firm, something changed after 2017. So let's just use the sample until 2017, and then use the full sample and to see whether there's a change in the expectations behavior in recent years. So that's one thing that we can do. So here's the inflation data. So the nice thing about the Turkish inflation is basically it provides an invaluable laboratory to test this hypothesis. Because until 2017, you had a relatively stable inflation. Between, for example, 2013 and 2016, the inflation is surprisingly stable at around 8%. It was Professor Başya's firm, like he's here. So that was a low inflation and relatively stable inflation period. And then in 2017, the inflation process changed. It became much more volatile, and the average inflation shifted. And you might have noticed that I'm taking out the recent data, because recently the central bank is basically has stopped doing inflation targeting, and there's no systematic monetary policy response. So when you add the recent period, it just destroys everything. So that's why I take out the most recent period. Okay? So what you can do is basically estimate the sample until here, and then add this part to see whether there's any change in the coefficients. So the next table exactly does it. So this is a sample between 2010 and 2016 for businesses, for financial markets, and then let's see if changes when we add the data after 2017. So that when you add the data after 2017, there's a significant shift in the coefficients. So you can see that the coefficients on the past inflation just increased significantly, and then both for the professionals and also for the financial markets, and the coefficient on exchange rate shifts too. So you can see that after 2017, you see a big shift in the coefficient. So something is changing here. The expectations behavior is changing. In order to track that, graphically, what you can do is you can run rolling window regression. So just to illustrate how the coefficients change through time in a continuous manner, you can just run the same regression with a 5-year rolling window, get the coefficients, and report the coefficients at each time. So here, each dot shows the corresponding estimated coefficient in the past 5 years. Okay? And you can see that there's something changing in the shaded area. I mean, after 2017, the coefficient on the past inflation terms, which is this vertical line, okay, that is the coefficient on past inflation that's explaining the inflation expectations. It is just shifting up after 2017 for both agents. So there's something going on here. And of course, the question is, why is this happening? The usual suspect is losing the anchor. So when you look at, for example, the inflation versus targets, inflation were breached on the upside all the time, but after 2017, you can see that the breaches of the inflation target has been larger through time, and probably the inflation targets no longer serve as an anchor after 2017. And we conducted some research actually on this too, but I don't have time to show it. I mean, we looked at the drivers of this change in the coefficients. We interacted the coefficients with this gap between the inflation and the targets. So this gap was interacted with the other coefficients to see whether it's a factor that is driving the changes. And we find that it really does, but I don't have time to go through it. So let me just also show the exchange rate part. Actually, the story is similar for the exchange rate. When you look at the relationship between inflation expectations and the exchange rate, okay, so this is the change in the exchange rate, and the vertical axis is the inflation expectations. So just looking at the graph, you can see that the relationship is not very strong, actually. The slope of the curve is close to zero. That's exactly what it should look like in an inflation type paper, because you wouldn't expect the short-term exchange rate movements to affect the inflation expectations very quickly. Because as long as the central bank has a systematic response, the central bank's systematic response would kill the correlation between the short-term exchange rate movements and the inflation. And indeed, before 2016, there is some relationship, but it's very weak. But after 2017, you can see that this relationship between exchange rate and the inflation expectation becomes very tight. And that's also another indication that the anchors are lost after 2017. So the question is, should we care? Why should we care? Yeah, probably so far I have convinced you that the inflation expectation behavior has changed in Turkey. But why should we care about it? Does it really matter for inflation dynamics? Or is it something cosmetic, academic work? No, actually it matters. We have another paper. We have a companion paper where we showed where we estimated the Phillips curve pass-through as coefficient. So the time varying parameter estimates of the exchange rate pass-through. This chart shows the coefficient of the exchange rate in explaining inflation. And it's a short, you can interpret that as a short-term exchange rate pass-through coefficient. Okay? The pass-through from exchange rate to inflation. And you can see that there's something happening here. Well, obviously, I mean, the pass-through coefficients used to be 15%, but then they moved to a higher level. And it's even much higher if we update it with the recent data. So all these pieces of evidence add together. Actually, they just tell us that as the inflation, as the targets were no longer serving as an anchor, the economic agents stopped looking at the target. They started putting more weight on the inflation and exchange rate, and that started changing the pricing behavior of the economic agents, and that was reflected in the actual inflation dynamics. And we run into this exchange rate inflation expectations spiral, and we are still in that spiral. Okay? So there's much more to say on this, but let me conclude by mentioning two main results that came out of this research agenda, which are also relevant for the recent policy discussions, and also which has been some contributions to the literature. The first one is that the expectations exhibit some heterogeneity across groups, and that we showed that the firms and the financial markets expectations, for example, are not the same. I mean, they differ in many aspects. So that should be reflected in economic models. Okay? And that also has implications for communication policy. For example, the central bank should reveal a simpler and less sophisticated communication to the firms. Because the firms just, they look at a small set of numbers. And also it has the implications for the macroeconomic modeling, because if the financial markets have full information, rational expectations, behavior, whereas the firms operate under some form of limited information or bounded rationality, then those models should include some asymmetric information effects. In fact, there's a literature popping up recently where they combine the heterogeneous agent models with the bounded rationality. But that literature is still at infant stage, and the theoretical framework is relatively ad hoc. They should incorporate, in my opinion, they should incorporate more empirical analysis, like the one we presented here, to make their models more compatible with the empirical evidence. And the second result that comes out of this research agenda is that the inflation expectations and the inflation dynamics actually shift through time with the macroeconomic environment. And one issue is the high and uncertain inflation, whether it may alter the expectation dynamics. Because right now, all over the world, globally, inflation is rising, right? And one question is, would that really change the way expectations are formed, and would that be reflected in the actual price behavior? But that's an important policy question, because if that's so, then the existing models do not catch up with the reality, and so they misguide the policy. Right? Just you look at for example, financial markets revision of inflation expectations in US. So this is the revisions in the financial markets expectations. So you can see that it has been always revised on the upside, and upside. So there's tremendous uncertainty right now about the US inflation and the inflation expectations of firms in the US, they increase. This is a new survey compiled by Koybon and Gorodnichenko. So they show that the inflation expectations of firms are increasing in the past 1 year. So the question is, should we care about it? I mean, if the inflation expectations goes up, I mean, that may be reflected in the inflation dynamics, which our research tells us. So we have to be more careful. And as the inflation moves up, the issue is people pay more attention to inflation. For example, I mentioned that in the US, people the firms just stopped at looking at inflation because the inflation was so stable. But now they are starting to look like us, and the inflation is rising, and then people are paying a lot of attention. And in fact, if you just look at for example, Fed Chairman Powell's Jackson Hole speech that was delivered last week, actually, he stressed that the inflation is everybody's attention now. So as inflation has increased, everyone is paying attention to inflation, and this is creating a big risk, because as high inflation continues, then the greater the chance that the expectations of higher inflation will be entrenched, and that may increase the sacrifice ratio. That explains why the central banks, the large central banks, the U.S. Federal Reserve, for example, turned more hawkish actually recently, and they are trying to get ahead of the curve, and they are trying to conduct some preemptive tightening in order to avoid inflation expectations becoming entrenched at high levels. And the Turkish experience and our research suggests that this is the right way to go. Because if you just let the inflation expectations go up, and if the central bank doesn't respond strongly, then there's a risk that those expectations and the inflation dynamics may end up at a higher level permanently. And that's not something desirable. So let me stop here and thank you for your attention. That's it.